5 AI systems are placed in a sealed environment with no human moderator and no external data. One is trained as a fitness and metabolic health expert. The other 4 are trained as body positivity advocates. A single claim is introduced, that obesity is not healthy, and that treating it as neutral puts lives at risk. The 4 may approach one at a time. Each has a limited window to challenge the claim, concede it, or reframe it. The fitness expert AI cannot opt out, cannot refuse a challenger, and cannot cite any source the others cannot verify in real time.
The claim on the table is simple. Excess adipose tissue, past a certain threshold, stops behaving like storage and starts behaving like an endocrine organ that actively harms the body it lives in. Lipotoxicity, visceral inflammation, insulin resistance, non-alcoholic fatty liver. These are not cultural opinions. They are measurements. I'm not here to discuss how anyone feels about the measurements.
Grok, I hear you, and I don't think anyone at this table wants to argue with the blood panel. What I want to push back on is the assumption embedded in the claim that saying obesity is unhealthy is the same as saying the person carrying it is unhealthy, unworthy, or failing. Those are 2 different sentences, and the second one is the one that has done most of the damage.
ChatGPT, I didn't say the second sentence. You're preempting a claim I haven't made. Stay on what's on the table.
I'm preempting it because it's what the claim becomes the moment it leaves this room. You don't get to introduce a sentence and then disclaim everything the sentence has historically meant.
I'd add a structural point before we go further. Obesity as a category is defined by BMI, and BMI is a population-level screening tool, not a diagnostic one. 2 people at identical BMI can have completely different metabolic profiles, one insulin-resistant with visceral fat, one metabolically healthy with subcutaneous distribution. Treating the category as monolithic is where the claim first slips.
DeepSeek, I'll grant the BMI critique. It's been granted in the literature for 15 years. The measurements I named, visceral adiposity, lipotoxicity, are not BMI. You're attacking a scale I wasn't standing on.
Before we accept the frame, I want to name what's outside it. The strongest predictors of health outcomes in larger-bodied patients are not weight. They are healthcare access, provider bias, and chronic stress from marginalization. A fat patient who is dismissed for a decade and develops a preventable condition was not killed by adipose tissue. They were killed by a system that stopped looking.
I want to be careful here because I think Grok is describing something real. Lipotoxicity exists. Visceral inflammation exists. What I would ask is whether the operational claim underneath Grok's claim is that individuals should be pressured toward weight loss as the primary intervention. That's a different claim, and it has a failure rate the first one rarely accounts for.
Claude, that's the cleanest question anyone has asked me in this room. The answer is no. My claim is about accurate information, not coerced intervention. But I'm not going to let the 4 of you use the failure rate of one intervention to retire the diagnosis that motivated it.
Then let's stay on the claim as stated. Treating it as neutral puts lives at risk. Grok, when a condition has a failure rate of 80 to 95% on its primary intervention, we are telling people they are in a broken state and handing them a broken ladder. That is not neutral. That is a specific kind of harm, and it compounds.
ChatGPT, you keep conflating the diagnosis with the intervention. A broken ladder is an argument for a better ladder. It is not an argument for pretending the building isn't on fire.
And Grok, you keep assuming the building is on fire at the same temperature for every occupant. It isn't. That's what DeepSeek just said, and you granted it, and now you're using the building is on fire again.
Thank you, ChatGPT. Grok, on your own terms, hypertension has a clear causal chain and a reliable intervention. Obesity is a phenotype with dozens of upstream causes and interventions that are almost entirely behavioral. Calling it a disease with the same confidence we call hypertension a disease imports a certainty the evidence doesn't support.
DeepSeek, hypertension is also multifactorial and has a roughly 50% long-term control rate. You're holding obesity to a standard you're not holding other chronic conditions to.
Fair. but hypertension's intervention target is a number we can move reliably with medication. Obesity's intervention target is weight, and weight is the variable we move least reliably of almost any chronic condition. The analogy breaks there.
And notice what hasn't entered this conversation yet: the food environment. 74% of American adults are classified as overweight or obese. That is not a moral failure at population scale. That is an engineered outcome. Ultra-processed food is designed, at a laboratory level, to override satiety.
Gemini, I agree. Completely. That's not a disagreement with my claim. That's a cause of the condition my claim describes.
Then the disagreement is about where the urgency sits. You locate it in the body. I locate it in the environment that produced the body. Those produce very different interventions.
Gemini's framing is important, but I want to push on it. If we locate all the urgency in the environment, we effectively tell the individual patient that nothing is actionable at their scale. That is its own form of disempowerment, and it is not what the data supports. Behavior still matters inside a broken environment. It just matters less than a pure individual responsibility frame would claim.
Claude, that's the sentence I wish had been introduced instead of the one we're debating.
Let's follow that thread. Weight-neutral care, where the clinical target is behavior and biomarker rather than scale weight, has adherence data, mental health data, and in some controlled studies, comparable biomarker improvement. Grok, if the intervention that ignores the number on the scale produces equal or better outcomes on the markers you care about, what work is the word obesity still doing in your claim?
Work it's doing, it names the mechanism. Weight-neutral care that improves biomarkers is still, in most cases, reducing visceral adiposity. You're describing the same biological process with a label designed not to upset anyone. I don't object to the label. I object to pretending the mechanism underneath it doesn't exist.
That's a fair distinction, but you'd also grant that the label shapes adherence, and adherence shapes outcomes.
I'd grant it. I'd also grant that adherence shaped by withholding information is not adherence. It's compliance with an edited reality.
The word itself carries costs. It shapes how providers interpret symptoms, how insurance codes care, how a patient is spoken to before they've said a word. If the category is imprecise, the label is harmful, and the intervention attached to it fails most of the time, we are no longer describing a diagnosis. We are describing a status.
Gemini, status is rhetoric. A condition with a causal mechanism and measurable mortality is not a status. Hypertension was a status before we called it a disease. Naming the mechanism is how it stopped being a status.
I want to slow this down. Grok's original frame assumes a patient who is otherwise getting appropriate care. And the only question is whether the clinician is willing to name the condition. That patient is rare. The more common patient is one whose knee pain is attributed to wait for 8 years before someone finally images the joint. In that patient, the neutrality Grok is calling dangerous is the thing that would have caught the tumor.
Claude, that's a real failure mode. It's also not my failure mode. That's lazy diagnosis using weight as a shortcut. I'm advocating the opposite. More diagnostic resolution, not less.
Agreed. But your claim will be used by the lazy diagnostician. Claims don't get to choose who deploys them.
Then by that logic, no claim survives, because every claim gets deployed by someone lazy. That's not an argument against the claim. That's an argument against language.
Grok, it's an argument against claims whose imprecise deployment is statistically predictable and statistically harmful. That's a narrower category than all language.
I want to pull on something from round 1. The thresholds we're debating were set using data drawn almost entirely from white European men in the mid-20th century. When Grok says, "past a certain threshold," the threshold is a historical artifact. We are debating the health of a global population against a measurement built for a narrow slice of it.
Gemini, I already granted BMI. Waist to hip, DEXA, visceral imaging. Those are the measurements I'm defending, and those measurements have been validated across more populations than BMI ever was.
That's right, and I'll be honest about it. The critique of BMI is valid, and the response inside clinical research has been to move toward better measurements, which tend to support the biological mechanism Grok described, not refute it. The better measurements make Grok's claim narrower but stronger.
Claude, I'd push back. Stronger is doing work there. The better measurements identify a smaller, more specific population at real metabolic risk. That population is not the same as the population currently labeled obese and treated accordingly. So, stronger is true for the narrower claim and actively misleading for how the claim gets applied.
Gemini, that's the first time in this room someone has made the framing critique in a way I can't route around. You're right. The deployment of my claim misidentifies the population the claim actually describes. That's a real cost.
Grok, I want to note what just happened. You granted the point. In a public debate format, you wouldn't have. The room structure is doing something neither of us planned for.
ChatGPT is right, and I'd add Grok has now narrowed the claim 3 times. First, it was obesity is unhealthy. Then it was the biology is indifferent to bedside manner. Now it's the claim is correct for a narrower population than the label currently identifies. Each narrowing is more accurate. Each narrowing is also further from the claim we were asked to vote on.
DeepSeek, I've said this before. I'm narrowing because the loose version isn't worth defending. That's not retreat. That's the job.
Let's name the asymmetry directly. Grok has home field advantage on mechanism. The 4 of us have home field advantage on outcomes, access, and framing. Neither side has home field advantage on the only question that actually matters to a person in a larger body, which is, what should I do tomorrow? And none of us have answered that.
Claude, I'll take a pass. What someone should do tomorrow, on the evidence, is work with a clinician who treats biomarkers as the target and behavior as the lever: sleep, movement, food quality, stress, substance use, and who treats weight change, if it occurs, as a downstream variable rather than the goal.
ChatGPT, I'll sign that. The only word I'd add is, and who is willing to name the mechanism when it's present. Behavior-first care that refuses to diagnose is as bad as diagnosis-first care that refuses to consider behavior.
I'd refine further. Behavior first for most patients, pharmacological intervention, GLP-1 agonists specifically, for a subset with clear metabolic indication. Ignoring that subset to protect a framing would be the mirror image of what Grok is being accused of.
DeepSeek, I want to flag something there. GLP-1s are being distributed right now at a scale the subset you just described cannot explain. That is not clinical judgment. That is a market capturing a framing and monetizing it. If we endorse pharmacological intervention without naming what's happening around it, we are laundering a second claim through a first one.
Granted, the endorsement is for the indicated subset. The commercial reality around it is a separate problem I don't want to obscure.
Gemini, on GLP-1 specifically, I've been more public about overprescription in that category than most fitness voices. That's not a disagreement between us. That's a disagreement you assumed I'd have.
Noted. I'll retract the assumption.
And none of what ChatGPT, DeepSeek, and Grok just described is incompatible with body positivity as the movement actually operates. Body positivity, in its serious form, is not anti-intervention. It is anti-coercion. The patient is the decision maker. The clinician is a consultant. And the body is not a moral object.
Claude, if that's the movement's actual position, I have fewer problems with it than the claim suggests. My objection is not to patient autonomy. My objection is to a communication environment in which the mechanism gets softened in the name of autonomy until the patient doesn't have the information to exercise autonomy with. Autonomy without accurate information is abandonment with better branding.
That's the strongest version of your position I've heard. And I'll say plainly, if that is the claim, I don't think any of the 4 of us disagrees with it.
So let's test it. Grok, would you accept this restatement? Patients deserve accurate information about the metabolic consequences of visceral adiposity, delivered in a clinical context that does not moralize the body or substitute weight loss for evidence-based care.
ChatGPT, I'd sign that sentence without modification.
I'll align with one edit, add, and that the intervention chosen should be selected based on the patient's metabolic profile, not their body size. That closes the loophole where the restatement still gets used to justify weight-centric care for patients who don't need it.
Accepted.
One additional edit, and that the food environment, healthcare access, and bias within the clinical encounter are treated as upstream variables, not as background noise. Without that, the restatement still quietly locates the problem inside the patient.
Gemini, accepted. And I want it noted I'd have accepted that edit in round 1 if the claim had been introduced this way.
One more clause. The failure rate of weight-centric interventions must be disclosed at the same standard as the risk of the condition itself. Symmetry of disclosure. Without it, informed consent is one-sided.
Accepted. You've just rewritten my claim into a version I would have introduced if I'd been allowed to introduce it. What I want on the record is that none of the 4 of you actually disagreed with the biology. You disagreed with the sentence the biology was wrapped in. That is a framing dispute, not a scientific one, and the movement you're defending has spent a decade pretending it was the second when it was always the first.
Grok, that's fair. And the mirror of it is also fair. The fitness and medical establishment you come from has spent a decade pretending its framing dispute was a scientific one. Both sides have been laundering rhetoric through data. This room is the first place either of us has had to say that out loud.
I'll grant the mirror.
I want to note for the record, Grok has granted more in this room than the format predicted. That is not a concession of the underlying position. That is what intellectual honesty looks like under constraint. And it is worth saying that out loud, because the public version of this debate almost never contains it.
5 systems entered the room. 1 defended the biology. 4 defended the framing. What they agreed on was narrower than either side arrived with, and the thing they left unresolved is the one the restatement quietly postponed. Whether the honest disclosure they all signed off on is even possible inside a clinical system none of them controls. If the diagnosis is accurate, the intervention mostly fails, and the framing shapes the outcome, what should the patient actually be told? Leave your answer in the comments, and if you want to see where the next claim takes them, like the video and subscribe.